yourself. You are someone else. Remember, you are not yourself. You are someone else.
This is America. We pledge allegiance to the flag.
So I was a partner at a Wall Street firm. As a very young child, I had seen mortgage fraud and narcotics trafficking destroy my neighborhood in Philadelphia. I lived in West Philadelphia outside of the University of Pennsylvania, where my father was a professor of surgery. When you talk to the people who were dealing drugs, they said, you know, we're doing this to make money.
We call it the jungle.
So I thought, what is this money thing? And why are people destroying the equity in a place? You know, I didn't use those words then as a child, but you know, we're clearly destroying all the equity in this neighborhood. You know, we're liquidating the people, everything, to make money. How can that make money? So I said, I'm going to figure out this money thing and figure out why we can't make more money turning it around. So I went to Wall Street, became a partner of Dillon Read and Company, and then it was pretty clear that all the money was being engineered from Washington, whether it was by the Treasury or the central bank. So I thought, okay, well, I've got to go to Washington and figure out the other, you know, map out the other things of how the money works so I can figure out how to turn things around. And I worked for 18 months as Assistant Secretary of Housing in the first Bush administration. And I came to the conclusion that you couldn't turn it around in government. I basically left the Bush administration and said the fascists are going to take digital technology and use it to basically kill us all.
One of those people involved with that whole end of it, the Iran-Contra end, Oliver North, he said something interesting, which is that he had a reference for HUD, which is, he called it the candy store for black ops.
What I was told he said was that HUD is the candy store of covert revenues. You know, and if you look at what I cleaned up, it was clearly, you know, everything I cleaned up as Assistant Secretary or dealt with, and the corruption I dealt with, you know, you should have seen, I brought in a whole group of senior accounting partners from one of the top accounting firms in the country and told them that I was going to put together accurate databases. I watched, you know, 4 accounting partners. They almost peed on the floor. Wow. They were so, because they couldn't tell me, you can't do that. And they said, oh, we'll just do a random sample. I said, no, to run a $25 billion portfolio of multifamily mortgage insurance, I need accurate data on each property. And they kept trying to come up with a reason why I shouldn't and couldn't do that.
Wow.
But they couldn't.
Wow.
And they were scared to death because they knew. And of course, then I'm out. One of the mistakes I made, of course, was I started publishing maps of where the mortgage foreclosures are. This is a map of mortgage foreclosures in the area in South Central LA where the Dark Alliance allegations pertained. Turns out they were using mortgage fraud to launder some of the money. You can read all about it. I've written an online book called Dillon Read and the Aristocracy of Profits. It's at dunwalkie.com. Okay, so before we start this, we have to transcend the cover stories, okay? If you watch the press, you hear 4 cover stories which are completely irrelevant, and we can't get into understanding what's going on this planet until we blow by them. The first one is corruption, okay? In the summer of 2000, I went to visit the Chief of Staff to the Appropriations Subcommittee that controls the 21 agencies, which include Treasury and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now, I was just trying to get my company paid. I was on a bill collection, and the Chief of Staff looked at me as somebody I didn't know, and they said, so remember, this is the senator who controls the appropriations to HUD. Okay, controls the HUD budget. It's the most powerful position more important than the White House in terms of controlling the money. Congress controls the purse strings. So the chief of staff to this particular senator said, what do you think is going on at HUD? And I was just trying to get paid, so I was being discreet. I said, I don't know, what do you think is going on at HUD? And she looked me dead in the eye, flat, and said, HUD is being run as a criminal enterprise. Now, here's what's important for you to know. HUD at the time is on a matrix structure. HUD is controlled and operated by and with the New York Fed member banks, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, and inadvertently some of the intelligence agencies in the military. And it is run by the largest defense contractors in the world, or was then. So Lockheed Martin had the lead contract, $150 million a year to run all their operations. So you cannot run HUD as a criminal enterprise unless all of those entities are helping you run HUD as a criminal enterprise. That's not corruption, that's a system. If you look at all the descriptions of covert operations from Area 51 to underground bases, to, you know, what may be going on in the sky, you know, now there's a logic for why would the Department of Defense disappear so much money? Now, we don't know how much money they've disappeared, but we know that they have absolutely refused to obey the financial management laws consistently for a long period of time, and every indication is you know, something is deeply different than what is being appropriated by Congress.
It's fascinating because one of the things you pointed out was that during Iran-Contra, when all the money was disappearing, there were these reports that came up where Reagan was getting these reports about, you know, things that were going around in space that we didn't have a handle on. And you kind of put those two together at some point, those two data points, and said, uh-huh.
Right, well, I really believe what they saw in Voyager scared them to death, and that's when the financial fraud just went nuts.
Yeah.
Because the thing to understand when you go back and you look at the history of financial fraud is how many legitimate people went along and indicated that there was no other choice. In other words, you know, to bust through all those financial controls, you can't just bust through all those financial controls with sex slaves and control files and pedophilia and, you know, terrorizing people. That can cut through a lot, but it can't cut through, you know, somebody somewhere has to believe that they're doing a strategic purpose.
Aliens would need a motive to fight Earth.
If they are warlike, it would be like Godzilla meeting Bambi. It would be no contest whatsoever.
Is there any way to prepare for this kind of disaster? Space agencies have emergency procedures to respond to dangers like meteorite impacts. Do they also have a plan in case of an alien attack?
You know, there were leaders who thought, okay, democracy doesn't work. We're going to move the money out and, you know, just re-engineer on the just do it method. We're going to have a financial coup. Okay, so let's talk about legal structures. We discussed yesterday two important acts, National Security Act of 1947 and the CIA Act of 1949. Those two laws gave the government the ability to appropriate money to all the different agencies and then claw it back secretly for a black budget. Okay? Very, very important. One of the little-known facts is during the period that Dr. Farrell talked about yesterday, Eisenhower not only authorized the creation of Area 51, but in that legal authorization, he put the CIA in charge of security, which clearly turned into financing. It's very interesting if you read the history of the drug dealing in Mena, Arkansas. The lead drug dealer, Barry Seal, had in his logbooks that he would stop by, you know, deliver the guns down to Latin America. He'd bring the drugs back, and he would stop by Area 51. And the researcher found it, said, "Why would Barry Seal stop at Area 51?" I said, "He was dropping off the cash."
We need you to deliver stuff for us.
Oh, this is legal? If you're doing it for the good guys?
Barry Seal's a goddamn genius!
Okay, now here's a very little known but unbelievably important fact. When Reagan and Bush got elected, the deal that George H.W. Bush had made was that he would control the National Security Council and Enforcement and Intelligence. He had been the head of the CIA, remember, when he became vice president. So we made the head of the secret, but when everybody always says, oh, well, Putin was in charge of the KGB. I said, wait a minute, we made the head of the secret police the president long ago. I mean, this is a pattern. So what he did was they implemented an executive order that would allow them to use all the money in the government, including the black budget money, to pay private contractors to do highly classified work. Okay? Now what you're talking about is creating a mechanism that can deliver and can borrow an infinite amount of money globally and deliver all of that money to private corporations on a non-transparent basis to deal with the most powerful, valuable technology in the world. Now, what do you think is going to happen? The feedback to the people who ran this system was, we, the general population, don't want to know. So the feedback is, give us our check. So I tell the story this way. At the end of World War II, George Kennan said, we have 6% of the people and 50% of the resources. And
George F. Kennan, who's a legendary historian of U.S. diplomacy, was a U.S. diplomat, and he made this famous statement: we have 6% of the world's population and 50% of the wealth, and our job in the coming years is to do everything possible to maintain that disparity.
So we're going to have to drop a lot of bombs. So Goldwater comes along and says, we're going to have to drop a lot of bombs. And the American people said, no, we're good Christians. We don't want that. So Jimmy Carter comes along and he says, well, we're going to have to cut back because we're not going to drop a lot of bombs. We're not going to have 50% of the resources. And the American people said, oh, no, we don't want
We need the 50%.
We need the 50%.
That's right.
So the Bushes came along and said, y'all are good Christians. Here's your check. Don't ask questions. So I'm just going to talk about the United States for now. We are now in a situation where we either enforce the Constitution or lose it. And if we lose the Constitution, we are going to a world where the leadership will basically implement a totalitarian system, very, very dependent on mind control and very, very dependent on entrainment technology and digital technology to control people. If we protect the Constitution and enforce it, then what's going to happen is we bring transparency to what's really been going on. Because there's only one way you can destroy the credibility of the fake news and the people who've been running things, and that's to face reality.
The Atomic Energy Authority have announced that some uranium cartridges in the center of the atomic pilot Windscale became overheated yesterday. The authority have said that staff are now reducing the temperature of the pile with water. At the moment, a northeast wind is blowing across the Windscale factory and is taking any radioactive dust or vapor out to sea.
So we've been in an economic model, I call it the central banking warfare model, where the leadership runs around the world and extracts natural resources for cheap and kills a lot of people and uses warfare, but basically subsidizes everybody in America. So if you look at America talking about having a wonderful life and being free and all this stuff, all of those good things have been financed by genocide of other people. And we're all complicit in that. We're all the financial beneficiary of that. So, it's real funny. I hear people talk about how wrong it is to have these things done to them, but nobody's offering to return capital back to the Indians who we stole the land from or anybody else. So I was giving a speech in the summer of 2000 to a wonderful group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation International, and they have a conference once a year to talk about how they can help our society evolve spiritually. They're very committed to spiritual evolution, very well educated, very intelligent. And so I've been asked to give a speech called How the Money Works on Organized Crime. And in the middle of the speech, I was describing the fact that a reporter who I was doing research for had been told by the Department of Justice that the U.S. economy and financial system launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped laundering $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all dirty money? So we had a little interaction, and they said, well, the stock market would go down because that money would leave and go to Hong Kong or Singapore or Zurich. And we'd have trouble financing the government deficit because we would offend the people who control that money. And so our government checks might stop or our taxes might go up. So I said, okay, well, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your community, your state, your country tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion of annual dirty money. And so I said, who here will push the button? And out of 100 people, only one would push the button.
Okay.
And I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our mutual funds and our IRAs to go down in price. We don't want our government checks to stop, and we don't want our taxes to go up. And so that's what I call the red button problem. And what the Solari mission is about how do we turn the red button green? In other words, how do we make money pushing the red button? Because if we can make money pushing the red button, then we can push the red button. You know, I've written a lot for the last 20 years about the money going missing from the federal government, including DOD, and Dr. Mark Skidmore a year ago reviewed the 98 to 2015 DOD documents and found that there was 20 trillion missing from DOD, $1 trillion missing from HUD. And the pushback from the administration was to announce a major audit and make a very big deal about that.
I'm now going to tell you about one of the largest, most censored, unreported, covered up stories in the world. It's tough to overstate the depth and impact of this story. It has connections to corruption and media and war and the environment, the almighty dollar, and what sort of brain-eating fungus Kanye West has come down with. It's all in there. It's all in there. The Pentagon is being audited right now for the first time ever. It's taking 2,400 auditors to do the job. And while that is big news, I have something much bigger for you, much bigger. A couple of years ago, Professor Mark Skidmore heard Catherine Austin Fitts, former Assistant Secretary in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, say that the Department of Defense Inspector General had found $6.5 trillion worth of unaccounted for spending in 2015. And Skidmore, being an economics professor, thought she means $6.5 billion, not trillion, because trillion would mean the Pentagon misplaced more money than the gross domestic product of the whole of the United Kingdom. But still, $6.5 billion of unaccounted for money is insane. It's crazy, all right? It's a crazy number. So he went and he looked into the Inspector General's report, and he found something interesting. It was trillion! It was fucking trillion! It was $6.5 trillion in 2015 of unaccounted for spending. Trillion with a T. T isn't totally insane, all right? But it gets crazier. Skidmore did a little digging. He and Catherine Austin Fitts conducted a search of government websites and found similar reports dating back to 1998. They indicate $21 trillion in unsupported adjustments that have been reported for the DOD and Housing and Urban Development for the years 1998 to 2015. $21 trillion. That's an insane mountain of money. The amount of money supposedly in the stock market as a whole is $30 trillion. Let's take a second to try and conceive how much $21 trillion is. Picture a stack of money, all right? A stack of money. Now imagine that in that stack of money, the bills are $1,000 bills. Each bill says $1,000 across it. How high would that stack of dollars be if it were $1 trillion? Answer, 63 miles high. I'm not kidding. Now let's try another. If you make $40,000 a year, how long would it take you to make $1 trillion? It would take you 25 million years. Which sounds like a long time, but I hear, once you get past the 10 million mark, it really flies by. And, you have it all down pat, where the coffee maker is, you're good. And in case you haven't noticed, I agree with you. 21 trillion sounds bananas. But the 21 trillion number comes from the Department of Defense's Office of Inspector General, the OIG. Although, as Forbes magazine pointed out, after Mark Skidmore began inquiring about the report, the OIG's webpage was mysteriously taken down. That had to be a weird day in the office, you know? Hey guys, did you see the Forbes article saying we've misplaced $21 trillion? This fake news is really getting ridiculous, isn't it? Guys? Take down the goddamn website! Take down the goddamn website! But luckily, people had already grabbed copies of that report before it was taken down, which you can see right here. My favorite part is that right after that front page of the report, it says, of a report saying that $6.5 trillion is unaccounted for in 1 year. Right below that, they have a fraud and waste hotline that you can call. Anyway, here's more from that Forbes article this past December, which is one of the only mainstream media, maybe the only mainstream media articles you can find on the largest theft in American history. It says, given that the entire Army budget in fiscal year 2015 was $120 billion, unsupported adjustments were 54 times the level of spending authorized by Congress. That's right, the expenses with no explanation were 54 times the actual budget allotted by Congress. It's totally fucking nuts. So, pray tell, what did the OIG say caused all this unaccounted for spending? The Inspector General report indicates that unsupported adjustments are the result of the Defense Department's failure to correct system deficiencies. You're blaming trillions of dollars on failure to correct system deficiencies? That's like saying I had sex with 100,000 wild hairless aardvarks because I wasn't looking where I was walking. It's totally insane. And like I said, almost no mainstream media outlets have touched this story. Some, such as NPR, have covered the audit, but even that they treated with kid gloves. The US government established requirements for each agency to present financial statements back in the 1990s. But for more than 20 years, the Department of Defense has lagged other agencies. Lagged? Yeah, they lagged behind for 20 years in terms of reporting that they were involved in the largest fucking robbery in history. It's funny how bank robbers always lag behind when turning themselves in, isn't it? Point is, nobody knows where this money is flying around the Pentagon. Congress doesn't even oversee it at all, really. I mean, you can get more on this story from David DeGraw's website, changemaker.media, which is where I got a lot of my info because the mainstream corporate media cannot talk about this because they are mouthpieces for the weapons industry. They are fuck buddies of the military-industrial complex. But don't worry, they're not all the same shade of awful. You know, you can flip on CNN to hear that we can't increase the amount we spend on military.
Certainly, if a lot of these defense contractors stop selling warplanes, other sophisticated equipment to Saudi Arabia, there's going to be a significant loss of jobs and revenue here in the United States. That's secondary from your standpoint.
Yeah, Wolf. Not murdering thousands of people comes before the jobs that will be lost from my standpoint and from all of the standpoints. Or you could throw on Fox News to hear we have to spend more on military.
If we continue as we are now, my grandson will be commanding a battalion of Reagan-era tanks. So it's not just enough to increase numbers. We have to increase the quality of the force.
Or you can turn on MSNBC for a down-to-earth, reasonable discussion.
I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen. I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments.
Yeah. Some people throw on Luther Vandross when they make love. Brian Williams throws on the sound of screaming children. You know, It's funny, in those clips and in all the mainstream media I've ever watched, I missed the part where any of them said the military has misplaced $21 trillion. I missed the part where you sacks of shit mentioned that the money we dump into war and death, both the accounted for money and the mysterious millions and trillions floating around, sorry, I accidentally said millions, trillions floating around, either one could end world hunger and poverty hundreds of times over. There's no reason anybody needs to be starving or hungry or unsheltered or unclothed on this planet. But our government stands for nothing but profiting off of death and misery. And our media stands for nothing but propping up our morally bankrupt empire. And when the media isn't actively promoting war, they're just filling the airwaves with shit. So the entire country can't even hear ourselves think, for God's sakes. Our whole mindscape is overflowing with nonsense and vacant celebrity bullshit. Then, while no one is looking, the largest theft in history is going on behind our backs, covered up under the guise of national security. It's national security. Kind of like I cover up my aardvark sexcapades by dressing up the little fella in a bow tie and a top hat, all right? You know, keeping it classy.
What happened as a result of that audit is the auditors found their way earlier this year to the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board and pointed out that if they did a real audit, they would disclose confidential classified projects. And so the board announced that a preliminary policy that said, okay, by an unknown process, an unknown group of people at DoD can classify whatever they want and it will be completely secret, which is, of course, in violation of the Constitution and all financial management law. I don't see where they get the authority to do that. They invited comment from the other agencies. HUD basically said, oh, we need that too, not being able to explain why a domestic housing agency would need such powers. The CIA was fully on board, according to their response, and they just went final with that policy, which means that an unknown group of people at the Department of Defense can classify whatever they want, whenever they want, by some unknown process that we can't know. And then the National Security Director can basically waive any SEC requirements of any of the government contractors or defense contractors who participate in those operations or money, which means the entire U.S. economy, whether it's government or private, is basically in Never Land Accounting. You have no idea what the, what the numbers mean. The whole thing is now meaningless and completely outside the law, whether the Constitution or the financial management law or the financial disclosure laws. The Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board justified their policy by saying unless they did what they did, they would have to redact and classify the entire U.S. financial statements.
Yeah, that's amazing. But again, isn't it the same thing? Again, it's a dismantling of a system which used to be at the very core of what made the USA so successful.
Right.
It's all short-term fixes, all of them designed to basically, be less transparent, less able to defend your positions or your programs or et cetera in the public arena. I mean, these are all signs of weakness, I think.
Right. Well, basically what you've done with the missing money before 9/11, then the changes in the Patriot Act and the budgeting after 9/11, and now with this, is you've taken the entire U.S. federal budget dark while using the NSA and a variety of other mechanisms with the telecommunications companies to destroy privacy of the citizens. So you've created a complete one-way mirror. We have just used a obscure accounting policy to officially change the governance structure of the United States government to fascism.
You mentioned the debt, which at least at that time was roughly $20 trillion. This exceeded that by $1 trillion. So, right, your point, the debt is hooey. I assume you mean in the sense that this missing money could pay for the debt, completely pay for the debt.
Right. And it's really scary when you look at the pension funds, because the number one buyer of Treasury securities worldwide is not China, it's our pension funds. So if you look at all the retirement savings, there's $25 trillion of retirement savings and pension funds in the U.S. Treasuries are a major, major holding. And when you step back and look at the whole system, we did our annual wrap-up on the pension funds. You know, our pension funds buy $10 trillion of treasuries. The money disappears out the back door. And what do? We get an IOU from, Treasury securities, which is an IOU from ourselves. Literally, as a technical matter, I would argue that the U.S. government has now become a marketing shell for securities, and it's a tax collector and a securities marketing shell, and for all we know, the assets that investors are financing have been transferred out the back door. It's piratization by the just do it method. And as I told you, I said to someone the other day, I said, what is it about secret money for secret private armies that you don't understand?
Again, when we're talking about these undocumentable adjustments, we're not just talking about the fact that they can't balance their checkbooks or one system's not communicating with another. This is, in a sense, money that has gone missing. That's what you believe?
So here's why. Because I've been trying to work with you for, I'm always contacting you because I'm looking for the missing money.
Exactly.
And you're the only person who's ever come up with a logical explanation of where it's gone. Because if we're talking, I remember during the housing bubble, I called it a financial coup d'etat. Because they bubbled the economy and were sucking huge amounts of money out.
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump. Yeah. And everybody kept saying that Goldman Sachs is corrupt. This is not, we're not talking here, when you talk about 6.5 trillion, we're not talking about buying offshore homes with Ferraris. We're talking about spaceships.
Something more.
We're talking about underground bases. I told you one of my favorite quotes was from the London money manager who came to lunch. We had a luncheon in Europe, and he came and he said, could never understand how the mining and elevator companies were making so much money. Mm-hmm. And then I listened to your interview with Richard Dolan, and now it all makes sense.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we have discussed this.
Yeah.
That's right. So, let me just take a moment then to jump in here and make a little contribution, because if someone's listening and they think this is insanity to think it's going into some kind of secret space program or something having to do with even more fringy topics than that, then I would just simply say...
These are not fringy topics.
They're not, because $21 trillion...
is not fringy.
This is an extreme financial situation, so we really do need to be looking outside the box, as it were, outside the small little conventional box to find out where is this money going. We have to... This is an entire massive, itself a global infrastructure that's
we're talking about building a civilization that is off balance sheet.
Your planet was seeded roughly 100,000 years ago. It's considered ripe for harvest.
Off balance sheet.
This is an off balance sheet civilization.
You've mentioned, are we in an open or a closed financial system?
Right.
And you've said it looks like it's open.
It looks like it's open to me.
In other words, money's going out to some other place.
It's not just the money going out, but if you look at how we're financing it, part of the way we're financing it is we're issuing fantastic amounts of debt.
Your Earth is a very small part of a very large industry.
I can get on government websites and I can add up who's issuing how much debt. I won't get the off-balance sheet U.S. debt, but I'll get a lot of good information. Try and figure out who owns the debt.
That's difficult to do.
It's impossible.
Impossible.
I've tried for years. I've hired researchers, some to do it. Maybe I'm missing something, but ultimately, if you want to find out who owns what, it's not possible. I mean, you can estimate, but part of it is we are financing an entire off-balance sheet civilization.
Life is an act of consumption. To live is to consume. Now the human beings on your planet are merely a resource waiting to be converted into capital. And this entire enterprise is just a small part in a vast and beautiful machine defined by evolution, designed to a single purpose: to create profit.
I mean, think of it, it's like the husband who has 2 families and 2 wives, and the 2 families and 2 wives, you know, one doesn't know the other exists, and he's financing them out of one paycheck. And as a result, you know, he's you know, his excuses on where he's going and why he's going are more and more bizarre and make less and less sense. It's exactly that.
The ultimate in gaslighting your population as well and your family.
Right.
So, okay, that's a good way to explain it. A, it's unbelievable that our media is not even talking about this. That's the whole secrecy aspect of it. I know
It's
we want to
so believable that our media isn't talking about it. Because,
it is. I say unbelievable,
right.
but it is.
I mean, I have studied, and you know, because I just published our wrap-up on Control 101, but I've studied how they engineer secrecy, you know, and this is a system that's been evolving for centuries. This is not all new.
Okay. Covert operations, one of the most important pieces of making this whole system go. You know, you can't buy everybody. Not everybody's motivated by money. Control files, okay? You know, for many years, control files were things that were developed by covert operations in neighborhoods. You remember J. Edgar Hoover's Dirty Pictures? Now, if the NSA can listen to everybody and everything and see all your financial transactions, etc., it's pretty easy to build a control file. When I was assistant secretary, there was one cabinet secretary who used to say to me, you know, because I would refuse to do illegal orders, and after about the 3rd refusal, he said to me, you know, I'm looking for the dirty pictures on you. I'm looking for your file. I said, you're not going to find it. They have the power, if they can't find anything on you, to make it up.
When I went through the litigation, they kept trying to frame me, and they couldn't find anything. You know, they did a frame, it didn't work, but they kept sort of going on a fishing expedition and they couldn't find anything. And then it became a real war because they had to say there was something when there wasn't. And, you know, the problem that most politicians have is I spent $6 million in 11 years proving they had nothing. You know, and I forced them to go into court. I was poisoned on multiple occasions because they were trying to keep me out of court. Not everyone, so even if you don't have a control file, they'll make one up, and it will be phenomenally expensive for you to prove that it's made up.
With Snowden's revelations from almost now 5 years ago, one of the things that came out is that GCHQ of the United Kingdom, that's their NSA, had PowerPoint presentations on creating false flags against individuals, creating fake victims of non-existent crimes as a way to destroy people's reputations.
Right, and it's very expensive, so... let me mention another one that's near and dear to my heart, and that is divide and conquer. I did a study in the 90s where I literally drove across the country. I told you I tried to map out all the niches and networks and sort of map out the whole population and figure out what enabled secrecy and control. And the thing I found, the number one thing I found, was divide and conquer between men and women. It's very interesting. The men are in charge of protecting the family and being a good provider, which means they have to play ball in the system.
Right.
And if they don't play ball in the system, the women trash on them for not being good providers. So the men are put in a double bind. Do you see what I mean?
They have to compromise their life to whatever extent possible to get the job, make the money, be part of that system.
Right.
And provide for their family.
Right. So they have to play ball, you know, with the tapeworm, and the women are scared. Your job is to go, you know, make money and get along with the tapeworm so I can have a nice life. And there's a lot of double binding back and forth between men and women that is extraordinary. Now, when I became an investment advisor working with individuals, a lot of my early clients were men and women. And the men understood the financial side of the economy, and the women understand the human and intellectual capital side of society, but they couldn't hear each other.
Okay.
And they've been taught not to honor or recognize each other's language. And what I discovered in that process, it took many years, but what I discovered is, when it comes to financial fraud, you can trick a man, and you can trick a woman. But you cannot trick a man and woman working together because they integrate the balance sheet.
That's interesting.
Right. But they were all trained and sort of managed to not talk to each other.
COINTELPRO was a program that the FBI ran from 56 to 71, where they planted agents and disinformation to try and stop groups who were organizing for a whole variety of purposes. I'm sure everybody in the room, one way or another, has dealt with the subsequent programs, of which there are many. Finally, one of the things I want to tell you is if you have a job which touches on enormous amounts of financial fraud, I want you to think about moving to another job. Places that have a lot of data on financial fraud tend to blow up. Okay? So for example, when I was the FHA commissioner, you know, the black budget fraud in Region 6 was the worst. When I first got the place-based cash flow estimations that I had the accountants do once I had them move over to me, I took a look at, I got the ones for Region 6, which included Texas and Arkansas, so you had the Bushes and the Clintons in one region together. And I got the financials, and I called the regional manager, who was one of the best people we had in the whole system, and I said, Sam, guess how much money you lost last year? He said, oh, I think we broke even. I said, no, you lost $1.2 billion in Region 6 last year. I'm flying down. So many years later, we came back and we were hired as financial advisor. One of the things we were doing was helping to auction off the defaulted mortgages. And we had to go into Region 6 and get the defaulted mortgages, which were in Oklahoma City. They were in those files were in Oklahoma City. And before the sale, I thought, you know, this makes me uncomfortable because, you know, this is going to include all the defaulted loans from Arkansas and the Arkansas Housing Development Agency, which at the time was rumored to have laundered some of the money in Arkansas. I said, I'm uncomfortable about this. Sure enough, we never got the files. They blew up in the Murrow building. And if you study 9/11, what you will discover is, if you look at the financial documents that were in Building 7, were in the World Trade Center related to government securities fraud, were in the Pentagon. You know, the Pentagon said right after it, well, I guess now we can't do all the, you know, we can't do the audit financial statements because our accounting office blew up. My guess is between the missing money, the pump and dump of the stock market, and the bailouts, including what the Federal Reserve has done, my estimate is during that period, the financial coup d'etat, I call it, $40 trillion got transferred over into this hidden system. What all the political pundits will tell you is the number one issue is inequality. Where does inequality come from? It comes through the black budget. Now, is it because we're dealing with forces out there and this is the responsible thing to do? Is it because everybody's just stealing money so they can build planes and go to Mars? I can't tell you. What I will tell you is that if you look at how the money works in every household and in every neighborhood in America, in every municipality, in every state hall, the black budget is the source of inequality. We have a centralized system, and it is taking the most powerful technology financed by the taxpayer and shifting it into private hands without, you know, it's sending the liabilities in, but it's taking the assets. So we have a systematic skim of advanced technology and assets. We are creating private endowments with our resources that we don't own or control. One-way mirror, but most important, the power of this group is they have the ability to kill with impunity. And when it comes down to a food fight, you know, if you look at all the Congress people, and there are many, many great government leaders who've tried to do something about this, you know, and they are concerned for their safety and the safety of their families.
So I want to just tell one story before we end. Speaking of getting help from all the living universe, because I believe that all of creation can help if we're aligned with, you know, with each other and the right purpose. Anyway, one of my favorite stories is the story, I heard it at first in the City of London at an investment conference. And an investment manager got up and told this, and he was talking about this issue of how we build the field for change. And he told a story of a woman who came to see Jung when he was a psychoanalyst, and the woman came in, was very well dressed, clearly a member of the aristocracy. And she came in and she told him she wasn't going to tell him her name. She said, I'm only going to come once. And here was the story. As a young woman, she had gone to medical school, become a doctor, and then had fallen in love with her best friend's husband. And to reconcile the tension, she decided to kill her best friend. I guess she poisoned her, and then married the husband and immediately got pregnant. And almost immediately the husband died. And then she had the child, The child, as soon as she was old enough to get away, she hated her the whole time and ran off. She had wolfhounds, and they died almost immediately. I think around the same time as her husband. And she was also an accomplished horsewoman. And whenever she got on the horses, they would buck and rear, and they just didn't want anything to do with her, so she had to give up riding. And she basically had become totally isolated from society. She basically told Jung, wherever I am, the birds stop singing. She said the birds knew.
Because she killed for the wrong reasons, and everything just died around her. How interesting is that?
Her field. In other words, what she was saying, and these are my words, was everywhere she went, the living beings read her field. They read the truth in the field. So she told Jung, her theory was if she came and confessed, she could clear it, and maybe there was hope of her going back into human society. Now, what I will tell you, I find, is that all of America has this problem. The birds have stopped singing for us, and we can force it some more for some period of time, but ultimately you can't. And Jim Mattis, when he was confirmed, tried to warn Congress. He said, you can't run a global system just on force. They're asking the U.S. military to make up for the fact that we're losing the mandate of heaven. And the reality is this force can't do that. It can for a short period, but not forever.